You are listening to Something Rather Than Nothing. Creator and host, Ken Vellante. Editor and producer, Peter Bauer.
This is Ken Vellante with the Something Rather Than Nothing podcast, and we have Leanna Renee Hieber here, author, I say author, but an artist of many sorts. Right off the bat, Leanna, I wanted to welcome you to the Art and Philosophy Show.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here talking about some of my favorite subjects.
Yeah. I just as a general introduction for folks, I encountered the newer work, A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts, that Leanna wrote with Andrea Janes. And it's quite the book, and it's already, I know, up for awards in recognition. But I just want to give folks a little bit of a taste of it, like how I felt with it is I found it so fantastic to have a critical lens, a social critical lens when we're talking about ghosts. And I think the way you do your book, you capture the authentic experience that individuals can experience of presence of ghosts or specters, and that's a real experience. And you also, in your critical analysis, try to disaggregate all the story and all the other things about why ghost stories might exist. So it has that critical look where whatever ghost story you're getting into, you're taking that knife and that lens to it. So I just wanted to mention to everybody how I encountered Leanna. She's also an actor, of course, a writer, a historian, tour guide, and what made me most excited, a very proud union member of SAG-AFTRA. So I'm very excited to hear that. First question for you, Leanna. When did you see yourself as an artist?
And that's an easy question because from my earliest sense of self, and part of that was easy because I was born into an artistic family. And I think when your family are artists, in this case, my father specifically, was a potter, and he's still getting back into pottery. He gave up pottery for a while to be an academic, and taught a lot and did a lot of academic advising. But now that he's retired from academia, he's getting back into pottery again some. But I grew up, in a potter studio essentially, and so I really took to art, both drawing line art as well as music, as well as singing, as well as theater, anything performative, anything storytelling. And I did love making things, so I loved sitting in the studio with my dad, and, he would just give me a wad of clay and I would make something out of it. And felt very supported in that regard. And so I was very lucky. It was also good to have him as an example, because I learned about how much hard work it is to be an artist right out of the gate. And so we hustled a lot, and it was, there were some lean years, but I also knew that was something that was his calling. And so for me, when I realized my calling lay a little bit more in storytelling than either in arts and crafts or in like sculptural stuff, I've realized that my voice was better in writing and in performing. So I truly started to think of my art as storyteller, because whether it was the written word or whether it was the word performed, or making up ghost stories as early as I can remember to scare my Girl Scout troop, which I thought was really fun. So those things, I think that sense of self as a storyteller, it's inextricable from anything else in my life. It's really baked into my earliest memories of myself are memories of me storytelling, and are memories of me sitting with pen and paper to create a story one way or another. So
yeah, I've talked to a few guests recently with they do a lot of different types of creativity, and two or three of them come back to that point that you say, as I've seen, as kind of foundational storytelling, and in with the different ways that you create, I think that forms the backdrop. That's one of the things I like about podcast, or even in this particular instance, being able to talk about your book and those stories in that way, to tell those stories. What in those stories, I wanted to mention a particular point because it felt different. It felt different to me. A couple points. One is that some of the women spirits and presences have agency towards the world in your description. I'll give you one particular example that startled me when I heard it and inspired me as a labor guy. That the ghost, this particular ghost, was there to remind us of U.S. labor laws. That in some of the industrial incidents, or the incidents with the Triangle factory fire, which you cover in there, that there's such deep wrong that's happened to humans, but to imagine agency on the other side, or if ghosts warn, or if they protect further from that incursion, that's a radical thought. Can you tell me a little bit about what I was picking up there?
Yeah. I think when you're talking about ghost stories, when it relates to something as horrific as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, which was the most horrific workplace disaster in this country. It killed 146 people. 123 of them were women and girls as young as 14 years old. And this was at a time before labor laws, and at a time clearly before child labor laws. And the fact that any of such things are back in the news again is grieving all of us that work in these kinds of fields. So I feel it's in terms of the warning, if you're going to be talking about a haunted location, and when we talk about the Triangle Fire, I get very, very emotional when I talk about it. And so every single time I get addled when I talk about it. I will say things out of order. I will let myself be completely raw to emotion, and my guests feel it. And especially
that's the
right,
space.
it's
The space, and I heard that. So yeah, tell us.
Yeah, I feel like in that moment it's tricky, because we have to make sure that we're not sensationalizing the site as, oh, you're going to hear the screams, or oh, you're going to smell the smell of burning, or any of the things that would be sensationalized about any of that. People who describe that place as a haunted place have had some sensory experiences there, a bit of an echo. It's we call it in the paranormal sphere as place memory, that something of that horrible day is kind of there because of the impact of that extreme emotional situation that leaves a mark. It leaves a psychic stain, as it were. And now that can be something really positive, but in this case, it's something really horrific. And I try to make sure that when I talk about it, it never comes across like I'm trying to make this a something to scare you as a sensationalized narrative, but it should scare you that humans ever locked people in buildings like this and then just let them die. That they died because of no safety regulations. It was an extremely unsafe workplace. All of the safety protections that could have been in place were ignored by the factory, specifically, pointedly. The fire escape was not maintained. The other things that had been implemented in other urban structures to prevent against fire, like making sure stairwells were metal. Well, in this case, they were not implemented into metal. They were made of wood. Everything was quickly consumed in 14 minutes. Some could get out through the fire escape on the 10th floor, but most had to jump. And the fire department had not been given enough clearance or funds to create 8-story ladders. They only had 6-story ladders. If you can imagine, the fire department was on hand when it happened, and they were 2 stories away from being able to help anyone. And the fire nets were not strong enough to withstand the force of a body jumping from 10 stories. These are horrific things in and of themselves. I don't need to sell any horror on this. I just have to state the facts. Those are horrific things. Why we talk about it on a ghost tour is because there have been noted reports through the years of people having an overwhelming sense of sadness and an overwhelming sense of horror, even if they don't know the history of that building. The plaque on the side of the building didn't go up until the last couple of decades. There was a whole period of time where NYU, it's a building that NYU, New York University, uses as a school. So there was a period of time where NYU didn't ever want to talk about that building or its history or anything, and they couldn't be bothered with it. It's a part of the biology department now. So even people that didn't know the history felt strange up there on those top floors.
Yeah.
So something's there. But for us, the going back to what's so important about this being a labor movement issue is we are honestly not trying to capitalize literally on this error of capitalistic greed and putting corporate profits over human bodies, literally. And so we have to be very careful as ghost tour guides that we are saying, okay, here's a cautionary tale. And I make this a rallying point of make sure you never, ever, 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 ever lose track of your labor laws, and make sure you hold your representatives accountable for all of your labor laws. Don't ever let anything erode the safety that literally these women died to get us to this point. And that's the thing that for me, all I can do to honor the spirits of I don't believe that those spirits are still there, trapped in any kind of place. That's just not how that works. They're not stuck there eternally. That's not how the spirit world works in my world. But the echo of their pain and the cry of that anguish is there to make sure that we, the living, do not forget them. And we were recently at the anniversary. So March 25th is the anniversary. It was March 25th, 1911 when it happened. And members of the AFL-CIO every year go and lay 146 carnations around the base of it's called the Brown Building now, but it was called the Ash Building, ASCH, unfortunately named back in the day. But the Brown Building near Washington Square Park in Manhattan. And the AFL-CIO members every year put up a wreath honoring the members, those that died there, and putting carnations with the names of the dead along the sidewalk. And there's a picture of that at the top of the chapter that I took on the anniversary.
I've seen that photo. I saw that photo.
Yeah, and it's really when I gave a tour that day, and I absolutely broke down into tears. And again, I said to my audience then, I say, whenever I talk about it, I say it right now, God help me if I ever stop being near to tears about this story. And so when everyone sees all of those carnations and they're standing at this spot, it is such a powerful thing because you just see how many there are. And it really just goes beyond me telling the story to seeing that visual with it. And, so that's particularly powerful. We try to just make sure that folks can have an additional impact with that, because we feel like it's a rallying cry that unfortunately in our past few decades, certain lawmakers and certain corporations want to keep eroding these safety procedures, these labor laws. But we also are right now in a beautiful renaissance of unionizing and, and that's a glorious thing. So we were really excited to sort of start this book out with the Triangle Fire as here's the delicate balance that we have as tour guides to deal with this delicately, humanely, but as a rallying cry for action, because these dead are meant, we can honor them best by making sure no other children die.
Thank you, Leanna. I got to tell you, I've done labor work for 24 years, and anybody who's involved with the movement, anybody you talk to who's involved with the movement can talk about their relationship with it and things that are inspiring. And just hearing what you had to say made me think of a lot of things. And raising your voice like you did and saying it directly allows history not to become a passive, like a maudlin affair, which it can be so much, because, how do you reminisce or think about a hellscape that is that fire? And I found and listened to some details that I didn't know just about the structure itself. it's just so conceptually mind blowing to me that all the things that would be there for safety to be able to connect the pieces and all that, that's all torched up, and you still have the structure itself standing in that way.
The great irony is that the exterior of the building is fireproof and was built to be so. And that's the sickest thing about it.
That was,
and it reopened. It reopened not long after it was cleared out, and reopened as a factory. And the
how long after?
Owners, within like, I think it was, I forget how many months it was. It was like months. It was like, it wasn't even 6 months, I don't think. Yeah, and there was a trial, but the owners faced no charges and were not sentenced to anything because they had broken no labor laws, because there were no labor laws. But my God, was their outrage. And that really, I mean, but these are things that, to go back to the movement, garment workers were striking since the 19th century. And just the year prior, one of the men who was writing about the incident, who was on hand watching it all unfold, was watching Triangle, was watching the burning, was taking pains to excruciatingly talk about the sound of bodies hitting the pavement. And I say this to be gruesome, because the New York Times reporter was trying to get it through people's heads what was happening. And he remembered and recalled, he said, I remember those girls marching last year, the uprising of the 20,000, when 20,000 garment workers in 1910, led by Clara Lemlich, a young girl, a garment worker herself, who got up, had been beaten by Pinkerton guards, and got up this was a year before Triangle, and said to General Assembly, I call for a general strike. And she said it in Yiddish, as many of the attendees there were Jewish immigrants. And then just everyone poured out onto Union Square, and it became the largest labor protest in the history of our country at that point, 20,000. So it's the uprising of the 20,000. So as this New York Times reporter is talking about the Triangle unfolding, he's like, these girls were trying to warn us then about this. And that's why he went into such gruesome detail about what was happening, because he like I want people to really get how terrible it is. And some, if you are sickened, then you might act. It's like the brave parents who have been willing to share some of the autopsy photos of their children have been mowed down by AR-15s in classrooms, and it's gruesome and it's horrible, but they're trying to do what they can to sort of raise awareness for something terrible, to sort of say, maybe this information might move you. And so the reporters at the time were doing this, and these details are visceral, and that, like you said, can make the past present. And for us, we can make sure that we are not on that slippery slope, because there are so many ways in which, the world will just grind people up and spit them out. And so there's, we're all in various stages of the gig economy as tour guides, as, in various, yes, I'm a union member for my theatrical work and any of the film work I do, but that does not apply to some of the rest of the work that I do. So, there's the hustle is real. It's difficult. But I think that's that rallying cry is just so important. And I think all of those little details, whatever we can do to make that palpable for people. So yeah, we start off with quite a doozy, but I do promise you that the rest of the book does have some humorous stories in it too. There are ways in which women can, they're able to like rise above some of the situations that they were in life, and have a bit of celebrity now in their afterlife that the spirits seem to even, delight in. So there is a lot of love and quirky stuff, and some bad ladies too. I mean, they're not all victims. Some of them are
in the Jezebel chapter.
And I'm specifically thinking of like the murderers. So although the jury's still out on Lizzie Borden, we don't really know. Andrea wrote an amazing chapter about her, and I thought I knew. I think we all knew. We all think we know, and then she presents all the evidence, and we're like, well, maybe. I don't know. And that's kind of the great thing about some of these stories, is that we think we know these urban legends, and then we start to really unpack the people behind them. That was our whole point of like this haunted history of invisible women. Like these are, yes, okay, these are ghost stories, sure, but they're a lot of urban legend, and let's try to separate fact from fiction. And can we try to give you an accurate picture as best we know how? This is very difficult because there's only so much that exists on these things, especially when it comes to ghost lore. It's not very always well documented. A lot of it's a lot of hearsay, and not always with footnotes. So there's a lot of unpacking some of those things. But if these are real people with real records, we can track them to a point. But with women, if their name got subsumed within marriage, so that they were Mrs. So-and-so husband's name, it's a lot harder to track them before that life event. So this was us trying to say, okay, who are the people actually behind this? What were their real lives? And then how, in some ways, were they set up to become the ghost stories that they later became? And in some ways, it was a bit of a hit job, like in the case of Sarah Winchester, where all of these falsehoods were said about her. Or in the other case, there were ways in which a certain romanticization of some of these women's stories led to a different kind of afterlife for them. So we try to represent a real range of experiences.
Yeah, and I think it's on the active component of too. I think with the the feminist critique and the agency that can come from, those who have passed, right? And so there's always this idea, which I think is a challenging idea. Like I'm very, very much connected to it, but to think about of how that potential critique of the ghost results in agency that is attacks the most violent components of patriarchy that destroyed some of these women, whether it's as workers or as sexual targets on campus or whatever. And I think there's something there's something inspiring about that, because what folks won't find in this book are playing with and expanding lazy tropes that reinforce, I don't know, for me, retrograde thinking. So do you see it as activist in that sense? And I mean that in a positive sense, in that there's a vibrancy towards action within the text.
We definitely we definitely did not want to just be a retread of things that we should, as a society, be getting past. We examine the tropes. We talk about the tropes and how easy it is as a storyteller to fall into them, whether it's the trope of the Miss Havisham, lovelorn spinster who is wasting away and melancholy for her life, when in reality, Gertrude Treadwell at the merchant's house made lots of life choices on her own, and it was her own life choices that made her famous as a ghost, and is the reason why the merchant's house is a museum and her house is preserved at all, because of her eccentric choices. And because she was a spinster and lived 93 years in that house when all the rest of her station had moved uptown or moved out of New York City entirely, she held down the fort in this townhouse on 4th Street that is like nothing else in the Eastern Seaboard, because of the way that everyone else was sort of keeping up with the respective trends of the time, and she just kept everything quote unquote exactly as Papa would have liked it, in a time capsule of the 1870s when she died in the 1930s. And it's just an incredible thing. But we're interested in, like, sure, we're going to talk about the fact that she was referred to as a sort of Miss Havisham character even during her lifetime, but we're not going to stay with those things. We're really interested in unpacking, and we are interested in an examination of these stories that give the women their voice and their agency. If that is activist, then fantastic. We're just trying to get people to think about these things. We're not coming at it with a specific agenda, other than trying to be as truthful to these women's histories as we know how. We don't know all the facts, and in the case where we don't know all the facts, we say we don't know all the facts. We know that we're not going to be the definitive end of story for these. History is still rewriting itself. We realized the merchant's house specifically, there was something that they, as a museum, found after our book was published, and they said, you know what, we just found something that even we didn't know, and it changes one of their narratives, and so we're going to have to wait till like a second edition to be like, by the way, the merchant's house found a letter about Gertrude's supposed long lost love that question some of the narrative of why they were kept apart in the first place. So anyway, the history is always changing and it's always rewriting itself. So we're not interested in trying to have okay, here is what you have to think about this. We're very clear about trying not to tell you, the reader, what to think, because while I am a bit of a believer in the paranormal, Andrea's a little bit more of a skeptic. We're sort of a good Mulder and Scully team, which I think you should have going into these things. But we really try to tell you not what we're not interested in telling you what to believe when it comes to ghost stories, because you don't have to be a believer to appreciate what we're unpacking here. We're dealing with ghost lore that has been told and retold. So that is extant ghost lore. You can completely not believe it and still get something out of what we're examining. And so I do think making people think is in our mission. We're not trying to create some sort of specific agenda with it, other than making people examine haunted places and make sure. We do hope folks will think twice about going on a tour that seems to exploit the dead, or that seems to benefit from sort of titillation, especially at the expense of the vulnerable. I mean, if you're going to go and tour a haunted plantation in the South, please only, go and support Black tour guides who are telling you the real story. Don't whitewash history, and history's painful. So I think that's, for us, our takeaway is, like, please be careful how you engage in ghost tourism, because some of it is very exploitative, and especially towards marginalized communities, it can be additionally devastating, not just to those disrespecting the dead and disrespecting, horrific institutions throughout time, but also then disrespectful to the living, who are still dealing with oppression in various capacities. So that's something that we try as best we can to engage with, but that's a tough, thorny topic. But in this, we defer. I definitely recommend Taya Miles' Tales from the Haunted South, because Taya Miles really grapples with this in a really, really incredible way. So if that's something that you want to kind of dig deeper on, please read Taya Miles. It's Tiya Miles, Taya Miles, Tales from the Haunted South. It's one of the things that we reference that several times in the book. So
thank you for mentioning that too. I was thinking when you were talking about that, oft forgotten, largely recognized as first African American author Charles Chestnut, and his writings, and I'm thinking of offhand stories such as the Gooford Grapevine and the idea of the conjure, which is a little bit different historically. But I think I thought right off the bat of those type of vibrant stories, they don't feel like tied to the time and language, the way that it's written with the dialect. And I remember way back then some wordplay with those words there that was subversive to power. So I always like that bit. One thing I wanted to mention too about saying something like you're talking about labor laws, and we'll talk about art next. But I did an episode with David Bellino, who did a documentary on what's called the Station Fire in Rhode Island from 2003, which had a personal connection to a friend of mine, a family friend, lost his life in that. He was a metal DJ.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's and it was recently the 20th anniversary. But I want to tell you just a bit, just what was sparked in my mind. Since that incident, and the way that Bellino had done his documentary was to be like, yo, when you go to these shows, look where you are, right? Like life or death, life saving type thing. And I think there's a cavalier attitude I probably carried around, other people carry around, that needs to be shocked and disrupted. I saw somebody, I don't get into it, people online, but somebody had made a comment kind of making fun of somebody who wouldn't go to a particular venue because of the way it's situated and how there's one exit in the back. And everybody's making fun of her. I'm like, yo, you got to understand. And it was just like, I never mentioned just like, hey, a friend of mine died type of thing. But it was like, and the thing is, what I knew, what was so shocking when we talk about the time that things went up, the sound insulation in the station, that concert hall that went up there, and that was made of almost the most highly flammable. It was basically like block gasoline, and the station venue went up in 90 seconds. You had 90 seconds from the first spark to get out of that building. And just, and so for me, I grew up in Rhode Island, right? And I'm not trying to stereotype or anything like that, but a lot of places you grow up, there's tired practices, and there's certainly many pockets of corruption in the state that I could tell you I knew as a kid, right? You buy your car registrations from somebody, and well, you also buy your fire inspections, and you buy your fire chief, and they never go in and inspect. And this is 20 years ago, and it's yesterday, and it's the place down your street. So when you say those type of things and we drop into that, it's like, yes, it might feel pedantic or overbearing, but it's like, shock, this can happen in 90 seconds, 10 minutes, 20 seconds. And a lot of times there are people who talked about it before it happened, who marched before it happened. And I think that's like that inspiring point is like some of the vitality of the things that we're talking about. I thought about the station fire, and we're talking about, it's a hellscape. And so I thought about that, and that was really an important point for me. One other bit I want to mention is that types of ghosts and stuff. I grew up. I have some Canadian French background, Quebecois. So they, folks, my mom's side would come down to the mills, and that's kind of aggregated in the southern New England area, and it's like my grandma, my nana, and the memes, the French Canadian, in the stories, and they speak partly in French and such, and it's such a history that I remember connecting to. So when I was reading the book, I was very happy to kind of go from different type of places and different type of encounters. We've talked a lot about the industrial. So let's jump from the industrial, not that it's opposite, but I wanted to talk to you about art. And you do a lot of different. I even saw jewelry that I started to order, but then jumped on to the interview. Leanna, what is art? What is art?
What is art? Well, that's see, it's a good thing that my introduction section to A Haunted History of Invisible Women, my introduction section is titled "Existential Questions." Because I think that you just asked one, as in what is it? So the what is art is kind of the trick question of all trick questions, because art is really in the eye of the beholder. You're not making art. You're not doing art. You're not performing art. You're not of any kind without an audience. I mean, and some people might have art specifically very, very privately. Well, then you are still the audience then. So it is, and you're doing something for some sort of reaction that you're getting for you. Generally speaking, art is usually intended for an audience. And so it really is a conversation. And the art is never definitive, because everyone can see the same piece of art. And I know from having, I have 16 books out, and there are all kinds of different reviews for all of my books that all have very different opinions about the books that they read. And some of them are lovely and some of them are nasty. And I have to just let that be, because everyone's going to come at a piece of art and they're going to take away something different. And sometimes I will inadvertently push a button that they didn't want pushed, or I will make them feel a way that they were excited to see written, a type of inclusion, a type of writing about a particular type of spectral experience that made them feel seen. I certainly have that when I'm telling my own ghost stories and talking about my relationship to the paranormal, when people say, "Oh, I'm so glad that you have had that experience, because then I don't feel crazy." I just feel like it's a conversation and it's never finished, because you make a piece and then that, whatever that is, for as long as society is still standing, it hopefully will be out there in some capacity. So that's, I was raised with a healthy appreciation for art history. Some of my earliest
Yeah.
memories are sitting with my dad and one of his art books for college, and going through and talking about composition through all of the great, many of the great artists through time. So, that was I've had that conversation about what does this mean often. And it means something different for every type of art, every type of music. And certainly there have been questions about what art is that have gone into the court systems. Konstantin Brancusi being one of them. His sculptures, he had to argue that they were art to get them out of like a customs. It was like, I think he was trying to get them through customs. And then it was like, and he was like, no, this is art. I made these. And the court was like, no, it's not. And he's like, no, really, these are my sculptures. It's, abstract art. So, those things do have these really interesting real world, follow-ons when the question gets caught up in legality and red tape and all these. I mean, Mapplethorpe being another one, the photographer who, nudity, that was big. I'm from Cincinnati, so that's where that all started and got really touched off a huge national thunderstorm about obscenity in art.
It's been a little bit of time, Leanna. Do you want to give a little bit about that, since it's connected to where you are about the Mapplethorpe?
Well, I don't know I'm not really very well versed on the history, but basically there are very explicit photographs of the human body that Mapplethorpe exhibited, and they're beautiful photos, but they are of various intimate parts of the human body and of different racial backgrounds as well. And this this very much got people pearl clutching in somewhat conservative Cincinnati, Ohio. And so there were charges, basically sort of obscenity law charges. I don't know actually what they brought, because I don't know how the history of obscenity law going into this, but that was, as I was growing up, that was like in the background of things. So there, that was something that again asked the question, what is art? And there's always going to be gatekeepers about what that means and who gets to be an artist, and what is art is going to change from one culture to the next and one time frame to the next. But just for me, it's a conversation, because I don't think it ever stops, nor should it ever stop. In the same way that, like, I think that if you're a writer, if you're any kind of creative person, I think you also need to be a lifelong learner, because you can't, if you're trying to be writing about the world, you need to keep living in it and learning from it. And so I don't think that should ever end either. In the same way that the conversation about what is art and what does that mean to you at this point is this big open-ended existential question.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughts on that. I remember one thing I liked about Mapplethorpe, in addition to his photography, were his ironic titles, because it'd be like man wearing a too small overcoat, and the man's manhood's all out there. I mean, like, I like that trick you're up to, buddy.
Right.
I like what you're doing. Okay, Leanna, hearing your comments about what is art, a question I have connected to, and I heard communication in your answer, but I want to ask the formal question. What is the role of art, and in particular, has that changed now? Is it now? Is it different today, 2023, or is it holding the same weight? Art's always doing the same type of thing with its role.
Oh, I mean, that's really contextual to every single time period. I mean, I write a lot of books set in the Gilded Age, working class artists in the Gilded Age. And so what art was at that point for a lot of people in the arts and crafts movement was a way to make a living. And for some women in the arts and crafts movement, it was a way to make a living without having to become a housewife to do so. If they didn't want to. So I think in a lot of ways, art has been a way of freedom and creative expression, and in some cases, employment since the dawn of time. So I think that what cultures revere artists and how they do, that's changed a lot. I do think that in this country, because we don't have state-sponsored arts in the same way, art is relegated to a luxury in ways that Europe has. Europe has held art a bit more sacred, and other countries
With
around the world
grants, like public grants and things like
right,
that.
right,
Yeah.
has publicly funded the arts.
Yeah.
Yes, we have the National Endowment for the Arts, but it's constantly under attack, and it constantly has to justify itself for its funding. And so I think that in this country, we've been made to feel like, if you're going to school, I went to school in rural Ohio, and so the first thing to be cut were the arts programs, never the sports programs. So, arts funding was, and I think that kids should have access to all things. I think sports are great. I think that's a great program. I just think that kids should have access to all of the programs. I was not good at sports, so I feel like I couldn't. That was not something I could do.
Yep.
So I think that you're made to feel sometimes in this country like art is a luxury, like it's meaningless, like we shouldn't be paid a working wage for it, which is a conversation happening right now with the writers' strike, the pending Hollywood writers' strike.
Yeah.
And also too the crux of the true horror of the AI generated stuff, where taking the creative element, the human element out of it entirely, which is a whole nother horror show. But people worried about every single invention. People freaked out about the printing press, and people freaked out about the Industrial Revolution, and people freaked out about the digital revolution. And we're constantly having to have these conversations about what does this mean for us now? And I have to believe in the resilience of the human spirit, but I also have to make sure that we are trying to, those of us who are in the industry are trying to take care of each other as best we know how. And yes, organizing is a way that we can look out for one another. I think is really cool that, that with the AI generative art stuff, that I think it was University of Boston came up with a program called Glaze, which is like a digital layer that interferes with AI trying to manipulate your art, which is really cool. And they were like right on it. And it was free. I think it's still free for artists to download and to utilize it as a way to disrupt someone trying to steal your art. For their, for their programs, and basically for those who are unfamiliar with the AI thing, it's just artificial intelligence programs were scouring the internet for various images without copyright protections and without asking for permission from the artists, and using them as training models to create different art off of things that were in fact copyrighted material. So, and the copyright is there not to be a gatekeeper, but just so that artists can be compensated for their work. The copyright laws are in place for just for people to be able to get royalties, to get income, to get licensing income off of the things that they have created in the long run. As an author, I get royalties off of books, a certain percentage off of things that are sold. If those books are uploaded onto the internet, that's as through internet piracy, then I probably will lose my book contract because they won't be able to report sales. Everything's about numbers, and if your book doesn't earn numbers, then you don't get another book deal. And so I think not everybody understands how the industries work. And I've I first started getting published professionally in 2009, and I've always been traditionally published rather than self-published, because I've wanted, coming from a theater background, I wanted a cast of people. I wanted an editor as my director. I wanted a team of people to help me with a book. I didn't want to just do it by myself. I think self-publishing is great for people to get their work out there, but I have always wanted a team of people making something happen together. And you do have some protections and insurances and some people who are helping you protect your own work when you are in an environment like that, especially with my wonderful agent, who is actually the reason why we're talking, because Sarah Megabo connected us. So
Sarah Megabo, big shout out. Love you, Sarah.
She's the best. And and so KT Literary is great. And that, so I think that the all this to say, the way we can keep looking out for each other is making sure that we understand how art is changing, not to be afraid of how it's changing, because it's going to change no matter what. We can't stop change. What we can do is try to protect ourselves in the meantime. And the more that we can do so in terms of a collective, things like class action lawsuits. I mean, Getty Images is going after some of these artificial intelligence models that were trained off of images that were protected, under copyright law. So it's interesting
Yeah.
that, things do have consequences. All of us are going to have to see, 10, 15, 20 years from now, where is the role of the artist in our ever-changing world. But I in the meantime, art isn't going anywhere. And so keep making it. But it's been hard because I've talked to a lot of artists and a lot of writers who have been feeling very, very hurt by online conversations that are making artists feel disposable. And that's the case across any industry that is looking to mechanize. And that's been the case going back to since the Industrial Revolution. There's been a fear of making workers irrelevant. And that goes for artists too. So all we can do is just try to navigate the landscape as best we can, keep our footing, and make sure that you are in community with others who can be looking for ways to shore each other up, and look for protections if in the case of if protections are in fact necessary.
Yeah, it brings up significant, massive ethical questions. I even thought of the hypothetical with when there's enough record of your voice, which for me there certainly would be. I've done the equivalent of 6.5 days of shows if you listen to it directly over 4 years. Ken's voice is completely duplicatable, which I never thought I'd say that. And so maybe yours could be with all the stuff that's out there. And then the conversation that I dialed up that you had and I had and all that stuff, people could hear it as if, it ain't going to sound at a certain point any different as of whether it really happened or didn't happen, which brings up a massive question of composition. I wanted to mention something to you, Leanna. This is about my connections with ghosts, and I'm going to tell you right at the beginning, boring as hell. So my whole
good
life,
boring ghost story.
There's so I was as you might maybe surmise an imaginative kid. I loved horror and sci-fi and comic books and all that type of stuff, and just loved the spooky stuff and ghosts and everything. And I always, when I was younger, I thought I pretended or I wanted a disposition towards contact, right? And me and my people work, people refer to me as an empath with how I engage with them in energy. But in my head, when I think about this, I always said, well, if that's there, I can have it in other realms. But I don't have those type of experiences. And the one thing, though, was an experience tied to a place that suffocated me temporarily. So I went to school at Marquette University, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a few blocks from where Jeffrey Dahmer's killing grounds, which was an apartment on the north side, was located. And I remember, and I can give you the build up in the background, right? So think November, Milwaukee, of course, that industrial, composition there, chilly, stark. And what we're talking about is the absence of a building. And what a profound experience was for me, because I couldn't, I was standing across. I wanted to capture the image, and it's an image I can see right in my head right now. And I actually did a project off of it with a gentleman named Donal Mosher, who does. I did a short class with him regarding, I think it was like the spirit of the place, right? So we're talking places and residual. And so I had that photograph and I added some components for this super weird horror kind of like real art project. But it was connected to my experience there. I'm looking at nothing, right? I'm looking at the absence of something that was there. I'm like, nothing grabbed me, nothing like that. It was the loss of ear in presence of what was. That was the experience, and it was like that big experience, and I never expected that, which just feels so different than the type of things you talk about with other folks who are super sensitive and being like, when I was here, here's what I saw, and this is the kind of conversation I heard. For me, I don't have that, and I don't lament that. I probably scare me too much, so it's okay. But I had that one experience, and when we're talking about the industrial in that background. That stuff is so present for me, like an industrial city and those old apartment buildings or tenements and stuff would hold all that energy for generations. So, like I said, not a ton of excitement, but that was my like I still don't know about that one, but it sure made me think from the time it happened to the present.
That's incredible, and thank you for sharing that. It's you're not alone in an experience like that. It isn't as common as the traditional ghostly figure wandering about, but that sense of place memory and seeing a building that isn't actually there, that there is a record of hauntings like that people see, and it usually happens when you are not expecting it. I think for me, because I don't go in, I think when people really desperately want to see something and they really are invested in trying to capture the paranormal, that's usually when, ghosts are like cats. They're not going to perform on command. So they're
That's helpful. That's helpful, by the way. That
they really aren't.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you.
It's true. They're really not. And so people that want to see things the most very often will not, because it's like that, almost that desire it'll either mean that your imagination is going to play tricks on you and you can't trust what you're seeing because your imagination will plant it there because you want to see something. Or it's that desire is actually going to sort of put a distance between you and a potential spirit contact. So for me, every single time that anything strange has happened, it has been when I have not been looking for it, have been focusing on something else, and then seeing something out of the corner of my eye, or it's just sort of a routine thing. And then my routine is interrupted by something inexplicable. I think for you, and I think for other people who have very specific kinds of hauntings, because I do believe what you experienced was a haunting, and that that was a place memory, that was a residual energy, that because you are in tune with that industrial landscape, it was there because you're on its wavelength. So I really think that for some people, they're going to see the things that are in tune with the things that they're passionate about. And in some ways, that's going to kind of conjure something. Sometimes I've had like a couple of really beautiful little encounters, and one of which I talk in Haunted History of Invisible Women, when I just get really excited or almost verklempt about something. And I had this fond little touch on my elbow. And it was just one of these things, I had such a sense of this fondness in this touch, but this touch was ice cold. And it happened because I was lovingly talking about the merchant's house. And I turned thinking it was my friend, and there was no one there. It was just a beautiful red settee that I later found out was one of the most haunted spots in the building. But it was just this little fond, goose on my elbow that was just responding to me bursting out about how glad I was that this building was saved, because it had almost been, everything had almost been auctioned off, and it had almost been, torn. We almost lost it to history. And so I just got really emotional about the concept of having lost this treasure. And it was sort of like this little goose that was like this little touch that said, we're glad that you care about it too. And I don't know how I could sort of intuit that in the touch, but sometimes when there's sort of a sentiment that carries with a touch. And again, I wasn't looking for that. I was caught up in the emotion of the house, but it's like that emotion of the house conjured this sort of fondness of wanting to connect with me about this place that these spirits also love, because it's a very active house. And so clearly the spirits don't want to leave either. I feel like that's kind of a piece of, like, we were tuned in that moment to something that mattered, that we were appreciative of. That building knew that you would see it because you have seen other spaces like it and would consider it in a light that it would want to be known. Like, I was part of this industrial landscape too.
Yeah, I really, honestly, in conversation, hearing that is it really just stimulates my mind, because it's kind of like so I, like I mentioned, I grew up in Pawtucket, and like where you grow up and how you connect with places, like it always kind of confused me, because I go to the places in town that are the opposite in general of, not all the time, but I go to places that I'm attracted to because they look like that industrial, because they're hollow. Like, I think of David Lynch and his, photographs of industrial space in Eraserhead, which makes so much inherent sense to me that I don't think can make the same type of sense to other folks. So when you mention that maybe connection or maybe love or desire for it, or like maybe love for it, like the
Yeah.
industrial, maybe there's something like tied
I think
simply to that.
it's almost like you conjured it because you knew, and it like revealed itself to you because you were tuned into it. And I think that there is something to be said. Like if you go in with an open heart to haunted places, you will have kind of an astonishing time. You might not necessarily have an actual spectral encounter, but if you go in with love, um, in your heart for the past to sort of reveal itself with an air of respect, and that's the core of the mission of both Andrea's company, Burroughs the Dead. That's her ghost tour company. It's a company I work for. I was her first hire in the company, and so I watched as the company continued to grow, and then we teamed up for this book. We teamed up because our core principle is respect for the dead above everything else. And some of these paranormal TV shows where these sort of ghost bros are going in and like yelling at in spaces.
The provocation thing, right?
It's the provocation, and it's aggressive, and it really turns me off. I can't watch any of that stuff. If you're yelling at a historic space, I cannot watch it because it's just so disrespectful to the dead, and it's disrespectful to the building that you're in. Very often, that has very troubled history half the time. So it's also disrespectful to history and the people that suffered there, and any of these things. And so that I just can't. Again, respect has to be at the first and foremost. So that's I think that's why you had the experience that you had, and I'm sure that you're going to have others in your life at other points, in moments when you least expect it, because it's not something that happens. Again, like they don't perform on command. It's not something. Even though I work in the spectral, my actual inexplicable experiences are maybe I can maybe count them on one hand. I've had a bunch of them. I've had other ones where the jury is out. Like maybe there were other things in play. So I can't say unequivocally, no, this really was a spectral experience. But I don't need to have a certain tally to believe in the paranormal. But I also believe in science. And so I don't think these two things are antithetical at all. And I think that sometimes the spectral realm and anything that's related to it is just a part of science that we don't know yet. There's a whole lot of theoretical physics that sounds a lot like ghost stories in some ways.
Yeah,
so,
right.
and some stuff about, other dimensions and various other things. And we might just be glimpsing something that's bleeding over from something else. I have no idea. Again, I'm here for the divine mystery. I love the existential question remaining a question. A big question mark is fine with me. I'm not someone who needs to know all the answers, because I don't think we're going to get them. And I don't think that expecting them is going to help them get here any sooner. So I feel like in that way, I'm very comfortable with that existential question and very comfortable with that divine mystery, but that really unsettles a lot of people. So I also want to respect that people aren't necessarily comfortable with
those
space.
questions hanging out there, right?
That's understandable too. I just happen to be comfortable with them, so it's good that I work in an unprovable area. So
I like the placement that you mentioned of questions, because there's different things, different ways to look at them, and I think. I don't know what it is. I find maybe because of my propensity to ask them, to be professionally trained in them, to be unintimidated in asking them of any person, tends to like really look conspicuous, because there's an idea that questions are invasive. And of course, they can be invasive, inappropriate questions. I think behaviorally that is improper to ask, but just in the sense of asking questions, there's always some aspect of provocation of opening up, and also the unexpected, on your side, or mine. So I want to hit the big one. I think we're running into it like right about now. And the question is, why is there something rather than nothing? And you don't have to answer it absolutely, given your condition statements before this about these type of questions.
So the existential of why is there something rather than nothing.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, from just a practical term, in just a practical way, there is matter. Matter is tactile. It's tangible. It's here. Our interaction with that matter is constantly changing. That's what's kind of interesting, is that even matter and even tactile things are not completely static. Atoms are still bouncing around. So I think that I'm I'm not a scientist, but I really like to use like science terms when I'm talking about existential things, because it's sort of
Sure.
like, yeah, well, there's also a whole lot of things that science can't explain, like the 21 grams that just disappears from a human body after the human body passes. We still don't know where that weight goes. We still have no idea. Is that the weight of a human soul? I don't know. But that's a quantifiable something. And so I really think for me, the something is trying to always be appreciating the some things that are always around me, because I prefer that to nihilism personally.
Yeah.
So, but that's my
Yeah.
choice. I try to be a relatively optimistic person. I'm a perky goth. I grew up in the goth scene in the 90s, and so I
Yeah.
feel very attached to some of those terms of like, okay, this is who I am. So I'm always dressed in black, and I may look like I'm going to be, in a permanent state of melancholy because of the way I dress, but I am in fact bouncing around and generally very, very excitable. So
Yeah.
there sometimes can be an antithetical in that, but I find in that antithetical, that's where I am myself sometimes a question and puzzling to people, because they'll see how I dress or how I look, and then and then there's an excitability or a bubbliness or an absolute, passion for the material that I work in.
Joie de vivre
Um,
in general, very much
that's
so.
the thing, and so I prefer to live in those spaces rather than the thinking of the void or the abyss. And part of that is too because I did also grow up struggling with some depression, some clinical stuff that is something that kind of ran in my family, and I was aware of that it ran in the family, but at the same time, I wasn't. It doesn't help you deal with it any easier. So I've had to make an active choice not to let that basically the voices of nothing kind of drag me into that space. So I'm going to be much more focused on the things that I can either control or that I can work on, which is my art and my storytelling, that keeps me going forward. Because it is for me, it is a choice to do that. Because I do understand the flip side of all of this. I very much do. And so I'm choosing to believe in the something. And I am a very spiritual person, and that something and that spirituality is very open. It is entirely interfaith, cross genre, as long as it's loving and not exclusionary, as long as it's a something of care and tenderness and not violence, then we're all good.
I really appreciate the point you just made. I think back to I had a recent episode. A friend of mine, Daniel Kern, who I actually went to school with at Marquette, and it was interesting because I'm I don't politically I don't know what I am, like kind of off the chart, Marxist, I think, generally, but the thing is you know Dan was a conservative minded Christian who taught me so much. And I had him on an episode recently, and and I read his book, which was really a practical guide to Christianity, talking about like issues that make no sense whatsoever, that seem to be conflicting within maybe traditional doctrine. But the one idea that I maybe had encountered before is he had made a declaration. It was like, the idea that if the God that is presented shows themselves to be unworthy, they're not worthy of worship. So it's the depictions of, the type of Christian God where if it goes against our basic values of what we would look for a God, in and of itself is an argument for a lack of duty to worship. And I'm like, wow. Like, I mean, I really got a kick out of that. I thought of one other point. I've had Lauren Rhodes on the show a couple times, and I was really influenced and adored a book that made me really feel comfortable after reading it. It was Morbid Curiosity Cures the Blues, which was a journal, I believe, or a small magazine publication back there. But the duality components, right? I don't want to say duality. The common assumptions around, like death or contact with these type of things is that it's necessarily extractive of you or dour or maudlin, which it can be. It can be tied to other type of things. But there also tends to be a reactive energy that I see to this, right? By coming in contact with the cemetery, be like, shit, I'm going to end up there someday. Maybe I should paint a painting or something today, like that. It has this vitality to it. And I think that's where the philosophy is. And I think that's where things are interesting. All this to say, I was in Portland last night, outside the door of the Coffin Club for my Joy Division New Order dance party, but it was at capacity. They told me to come back in 20 minutes, and I'm getting a little bit tired and older, and I didn't go back in 20 minutes. So next time, I'll make it to the Coffin Club. So I appreciated some of your
Please
comments.
go. Yes, please go in my stead. I would have loved to have been there for that. But at least they told you it was at capacity, and they were actually honoring their fire code. Going back, bringing it all back.
Going all back.
At least they told you.
You know what? And I should have validated him and uplifted him at that moment, but I was too disappointed.
I would be disappointed.
And too thinking of my own self to recognize his greater social act.
Yes, but so this is one of those things where this is a takeaway for any of our listeners who would dare to make fun of someone for not going to a place with one exit. Or would harass someone when a venue's at capacity. Think twice, because they're actually looking out for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I wanted to say with regards a couple other little points to the book. I appreciated the metal references that I found within Haunted History of Invisible Women. Hearing a little bit of doom metal reference for me was very enjoyable, and of course, what I saw to be unfortunate contact with Megadeth fandom and tying to some desecration of places, but heavy metal and its connection to some of this. I wanted to ask you, Leanna, now, when you had started writing, I had been going through what you've written, and there's a lot, and there's a lot of there's in steampunk and all these realms. Tell the listeners, because they're gonna hear our way of trying to do an interview for this amount of time with each other, but all those other realms. Can you tell us about how the books you have, how people find them, your website, things of that nature?
Yes. So we've been talking about my nonfiction, but I have 16 fiction novels out. So, and they're all sort of a Gothic Gaslamp Fantasy kind of feeling. So by Gaslamp Fantasy, we mean like a Gilded Age setting, but fantastical things. Generally speaking, ghosts. So the one unifying characteristic of all of my work is that it all features ghosts, and a lot of it features real history. So I create paranormal worlds in which or realistic worlds in which paranormal things happen. And sometimes those paranormal things are actually taken from some of my real experiences. I'll just sort of heighten them for the purpose, for the purposes of Hollywood, as it were. But so my website is just myfullname.com. And I'm also on social media, and you can find my books wherever books are sold. So I have several different series that are out, and they all have crossover characters. So you'll find characters that go from one series to the next. You don't have to have read them all in any certain order, but I would say that you would want to start in book one of any of my respective series. On my website, on the front page of my website, I have left a question for you that I try to answer, which is where to start with Leanna's books. And so I basically say, if you're looking for this kind of vibe, if you're looking for sort of a Gothic Victorian Ghostbusters with Jane Eyre kind of feelings, then you're going to want to do Strangely Beautiful. If you like the concept of Victorian ghost detectives in sort of the alienist meets ghost detectives, then you'd want to start with The Spectral City. So I basically sort of say some of the backdrops and the feelings of each of those various books. I also have a bunch of work that I've done the audiobooks for on a site called Scribed. So it's scribd.com, and that is a subscription service. But you have access every month to thousands upon thousands of things. So I have narrated my own audiobooks on several different speculative fiction series. So I have a real range of things there, things that are time slip, things that are steampunk and dystopian, and all kinds of different cross-genre things there. And you can do a free trial for 30 days. So if you're curious about that site, that's scribed.com. But also my website.
I am curious about it.
So yeah, so I'm sure that there'll be a link that I'm sure you'll put my name up on and my website up on our show notes. So I'm also active on Twitter and Instagram, so you can find me there. Just look up my full name and I should come up. And if folks have questions about my work, you can drop me an email via my website, or you can ask me via social media, and provide, depending on my deadlines, which I have 4 of them that I'm going into, I will try to respond to any sort of appropriate. It has to be an appropriate message for me to respond to it. But any questions about my work,
as a threshold.
Yeah, let's just have that there as just a bit of a guardrail there. But so I really love fiction that deals with found families, ghosts, sort of a cast of characters with their own quirks, who all have different talents and specialties coming together to save the day. So everything that I write has a hopeful ending, something that goes through dark places to get to a better place. I have horror elements in all of my work, but I don't stay in the horrific place. I use it as a way to get through to something that ends up trying to be positive and hopeful, because that's the place that I want to try to get to personally. So I want to take my readers with me through that.
I thank you so much for that, and we'll include that in the show notes. I did have one question for you because I think it's very important. I wanted you to answer the question why it's important that that folks should know the name Frances Perkins.
Oh, Frances Perkins. Okay, so we're going back to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire again for a moment. So Frances Perkins had been working in what was at the time in New York City, basically like a kind of consumer protection agency. She was sort of trying to protect people who were buying services, sort of like a Better Business Bureau kind of position was what she'd been working in New York. And she was, kind of well-placed and had good connections. She was at a cafe around the corner from the Triangle Fire when it started. And she came out and she watched the horror unfold from the sidewalk. And she stopped what she was doing and she went on national tour with Al Smith, who was the mayor of New York, and went into labor union meetings and went into factories around the country in industrial cities and started basically started formulating the nation's first labor laws. She then became the Secretary of Labor under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and she was the first female cabinet member in our nation's history. And she would go on to say that the New Deal began the day the triangle burned. Now, the New Deal, of course, was this sweeping legislation lifting this country out from the Great Depression. And it was a huge time for labor unions. It was a huge time for just general works across our nation, public parks, all kinds of public services. So her saying the New Deal began the day the triangle burned, she was keeping that horror in her memory and was working to honor the dead for the rest of her life.
Thank you so much, and it's so nice, and it's nice to address you as sister union member. This podcast is produced with Union Labor. Peter Bauer is the editor and producer, Union Labor, and Union Labor from guest host, and so we got it all around. Want to really share that and connect, obviously, in that way, and whether it's labor or the other stories from the past, when things went wrong or that injustice, I really was invigorated by the idea of activism, or the reminders of, or the presence of the women that you obviously try to make visible, or trying to make themselves visible in the work that you do. So it's just been a really great pleasure to talk to you, Leanna. And like I said, this is a way of doing one of our episodes together at this moment. And I'd imagine maybe the next time we talk will be a different type of way, which might touch on only a couple of the things that we talked about. Who knows?
It'll probably still be ghosts or some sort of spectral phenomena. Even in, next time I have a book out that's fiction, I'm pretty sure it's still going to have supernatural phenomena of some kind. I can't, it seems that winds its way into everything that I do. So it's definitely like a core theme. It's interesting for me that I'm one of the few people that, like, my nonfiction work and my fiction work really do go directly hand in hand. A lot of how I talk about the spirit world in A Haunted History of Invisible Women, I have my heroine Eve Whitby live into that in her work in the Spectral City series. So which is set in New York, and where I'm a ghost tour guide, and I walk, I sort of walk the reader through some of the most haunted places in the city, almost as a bit of a tour guide while you're reading. And I think that, so for me, the nonfiction work that I'm doing and I'm interested in doing is going to continue to feed the fiction and vice versa. So that's, I'm sort of pleased to be existing in this space where I don't feel like I have to choose between a nonfiction or a fiction mindset.
Yeah, I thanks for pointing that out. That's a unique space. Protect its borders, right? So
yeah, right.
We've been talking with Leanna Renee Hieber, and it has been a great pleasure. I know you got a lot of stuff going on with your book. It's being recognized up for awards. I wish the book and what it does, great success, and you great success.
This is Something Rather Than Nothing,